Maybe you notice I had 40-something slides. I don't think I'm going to be able to get through them all, which is maybe good. I have some co-authors here. I'll be talking about a couple studies. Joseph Schwieterman, Mallory Livingston, and Riley O'Neill. Mallory and Riley are graduate students at DePaul University. Joe Schwieterman is a professor in the School of Public Service at DePaul. And we're all affiliated with the Chaddick Institute for Metropolitan Development, which is housed within the School of Public Service there, right downtown. And so very urban environment, lots of opportunities to study transportation and different modes, and this topic generally about equity and multimodal. And I was originally thinking kind of optimistically when I put this presentation together about, okay, isn't it a great time to be doing transportation research? Because there are so many moving parts, maybe more moving parts in terms of the types of vehicles we have. There's of course the human vehicle walking, and then automobiles, electric automobiles, automated automobiles, bicycles, e-bicycles. Of course, we have buses and trains and all of their iterations, and now even scooters becoming part of the mainstream of some mobility in urban areas especially. And then there's, when you think about transportation system and expansion, you have expansion of the types of vehicles and expansion of the way we design for those vehicles, so how we allocate space to our rights of way. There are, we have different kinds of signals. We have new sort of cycle tracks and bikeways, new signs, new car and bike parking arrangements. So not only the infrastructure, but how we manage that infrastructure. Bus rapid transit, looking at different types of platforms and how we enter and exit vehicles. HOV lanes, high occupancy tile. You could go on and on, but there are, anyway, you have two different ways, and then a third new way that transportation is expanding, which allows maybe exciting, maybe making more complex, is technologies like information communication technologies through smart cards, smartphones, GPS, cell networks, and even data formats like the general transit feed system, or now the general bike share feed system, trip planners, all of these sorts of things, which allow us to have new socio-physical, technical arrangements. Not to say that this is good or bad. Some of them are, well, you have a distracted e-scooter rider, moving very quickly on a congested sidewalk. That's a new socio-technical arrangement, right? Other ways you have maybe technology filling in gaps that have been there in terms of providing transportation services to vulnerable populations. So just new ways of doing transportation, of course, also allows for, with respect to the center here, new opportunities for research and understanding them. But what we're seeing generally is, because of these new ways we organize transportation, consume transportation, there's mode churning, there's maybe succession of one mode to another, or shifting from one mode to another, or novel ways to combine the modes. And so that's generally what is our research focus at Chaddick, is try to understand some of these shifts that are going on. And you can see this just generally looking at something like transportation mode share, commute mode share from the American Community Survey over time. So we're looking at 2000 to 2016 for 3 large cities that have adopted large docked bike share systems, for example. What is you have a huge increases in the percentage changes in bike mode share. Not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily result in a large share of commuters. For example, even in the best case scenario here, you have Washington, D.C. about just over 3% using a bicycle to get to work, but that's a 266% change over those 16 years. So it's at the same time you also have drops in auto mode share. I'm not implying causality, just a shift or something, and who knows what's going on, just more people taking one mode over another. So lots of changes going on. So we see this in terms of mode shift. The two studies I'm going to be talking about over the next 10 minutes, one is called Uber Economics, and I know the session is non-motorized traffic. I'm kind of integrating multiple modes here, including motorized as well as non-motorized. Uber Economics, talking about evaluating the monetary, non-monetary trade-offs of transportation network companies and more conventional transit service in Chicago. One of the, and I'll talk about what the research objectives were there, as well as the dimensions of Divvy, and I'll kind of start with that study, which explored more of the social, spatial, and temporal performance of bike sharing in a period of growth and expansion. The research objectives of the dimensions of Divvy study, really, we wanted to understand how this system has evolved over time. How it's grown, where it's grown, how it's expanded, who's using it. Also look at gaps in the system in terms of service and performance. And then finally, what drives the usage of the system? What sort of variables, what sort of factors explain variations in system usage? And really that would help, some of these have implications for multimodal planning and programming. And this began with, I'm not expecting you really to read this, I'll just tell you what this chart kind of explains. It started with a study that was done here through the Transportation Research Center for Livable Communities. One of the earlier studies, we just wanted to look into the equity dimensions of US bike share. When it first started taking off in the US in 2010, 2013 was when, let's say, the Divvy system. But this is all of the bit larger systems that were in place in 2014 across the country and some of their characteristics. And what we found, this is just in terms of size, in terms of, let's say, population density of the cities and all these sorts of things. And then we started looking into and became a concern both in popular, you could read it in reports of concerns about in nonprofit advocacy organizations as well as in popular media that bike share, the way it's being implemented is not equitable in terms of distributional equity across communities, in terms of communities with different levels of economic hardship. So we looked at that and found that nationwide 75% of stations were located in areas with low economic hardship. So and a very small number in areas that have higher economic hardship. Divvy was about middle of the road. So that provided some foundation for our study. But that just looked at the stations alone. We wanted to look at usage patterns. So the figure on the right is showing for one day, it was one of the most, the highest ridership days for Divvy in June 24th, 2017. And it shows by time of day. So we're looking at usage or bike rentals at 5-minute intervals going throughout the day, and you can see how it kind of builds up. So we have this data on origins, destinations, and we're looking at the city of Chicago, but it was interesting also Evanston, which is at north of Chicago there on the orange, and also Oak Park, two suburbs close into the city, also adopted Divvy using their own, in addition to federal funds, but 20% of local funds for those communities. And we wanted to look at, well, how was it faring in different parts of the city? Where's ridership? What explains this kind of ridership? And but you can see how now it's going to start to go down. Okay. Generally, we can see this cumulative Divvy trips and stations throughout the study period that we were looking at from beginning in June 2013 all the way to June 2017. There were the initial rollout of 300 stations, and then there was the first expansion of 175 additional stations, and then another 107 beginning in the summer of 2016. At this point, there were about 11.5 million total trips throughout this period. I just got an email yesterday. I'm a Divi member that it hit 15 million. We have updated the report up to the 14 million, so it keeps growing. It's not growing though at as fast as it was in the earlier years. You can look at monthly Divi trips along this period too. And you can see that the monthly trips actually were growing quite rapidly in the early years, and then started to reach a plateau. The year-over-year growth between 2014 and 15, for example, was about 30%, and then between 15 and 16, it's grown by 13%. We'll see. And then also just the highest number of rides per month really was early on in July 2015, still the peak month of 533,000, and the peak month in 2017 was June, but it was only 505,000 trips. Interestingly, the highest growth, the months that are experiencing the highest growth are the cooler months, the winter months. And this could have something to do with the type of infrastructure that's in place, and also the maintenance of that infrastructure, and also people becoming more aware of the system and how to use it. But again, here's the number of trips over time. Kind of grew rapidly between 2013, 14, 15, but kind of leveling off in terms of trips per station. Here are some characteristics of this by cohort. So if we say these three cohorts of the initial rollout, first expansion, second expansion, there are some different, first of all, how it was implemented. Early on, stations were spaced at about quarter-mile distances from one another, whereas in the second expansion it was more about a half-mile away from each other. So it was a less dense network that was put in place later on. This is essentially characteristics by each cohort. Also, the average minutes per trip and the average trips, you can see that in the initial rollout, we have 10,161 average trips over the entire period per station, whereas only 503 average trips per station for the second expansion. So the productivity by station is actually quite uneven. How many people does the system serve? Initially, it was about, if we're just looking at a quarter mile from each of these stations, about 65 square miles for the initial rollout. It's grown to 114 square miles. How does it connect to transit service? Well, it connects pretty well. You have now, after the second expansion, about 5,000 bus stops, 121 L and 37 commuter line stop stations within the service area. In fact, that's one of the requisites in the planning and siting of the Divi bike share is to put them near bike and train stops. And also, you have 1.3 million roughly, which is over half of the Chicago population that is within the service area. Initially, there was great discrepancies in the usage of the system in terms of male and female riders. Female riders, actually maybe this is a better chart too, male to female trips ratio by month. And you can see that in some months, winter months, it can be about 6 times as many males as females using the system. But the overall ratio has dropped, so the gender gap is kind of closing over time in the usage of the Divi system. Maybe what also closing is kind of this gap in the distribution of stations by community or neighborhood type. So I mentioned nationally that there was a lot of inequity in the siting of bike share stations. After the initial rollout, the first distribution of divvy stations, you had also that same inequitable distribution, but that has closed a little bit over time. Now you have about 64% of stations located in low to the lowest economic hardship areas, but in the high economic hardship areas, you have a greater number of stations. So that has actually improved over time. Unfortunately, in terms of usage, though, the stations within areas with high economic hardship haven't been very productive. So 21% of those stations within, you have about 21% of stations produced only 1.9% of the total trips logged. So you have, if you look at the productivity of stations within, especially the areas with high economic hardship, the usage is quite low. And from that, you had a lot of different studies. In fact, there was one that was based in Chicago as well as 2 other cities looking at what are these barriers to bike share usage. And they came up with several findings. In fact, they parallel some of our discussion in the breakout session about public transit and who can use and who can access transit, especially when it starts to rely on smart cards and these sorts of things. So the unbanked, there was people without credit cards. Also just education, understanding how to use the system were real barriers in Chicago in terms of usage, as well as cultural factors. In fact, there have been some studies recently about inequitable ticketing of bicyclists within Chicago that has to do linked to their Vision Zero program. So it's very complex social environment. And so we try to tease some of this out in terms of our regression model. So again, we're looking at divvy, what's driving divvy usage. So we looked at a study period between June 2016 and June 2017 for our study period, just because we had a stable number, consistent number of stations. And we looked at several different factors, including neighborhood design, accessibility, travel behavior, and socioeconomic factors that may explain some of the variations in divvy usage over time. As the dependent variables, we had 3 of them, both the rentals from the stations, the checkouts, as well as the check-ins, and then the total, so the from and to. We used a MARS model, which is multivariate adaptive regression splining technique, which accounts for different distributions of the error terms, as well as the accounts for nonlinear relationships among the independent and dependent variables. And we found that, let me kind of give you a shorthand here, because we're talking about multimodal and linkages between transportation modes, found that first of all, job accessibility by public transit was one of the, explained a lot of the variation in transit ridership. So this is that S job access number here. So looking at the network connectivity, in other words, how the transit network is configured, explains a lot of the variation in the usage of different divvy stations. If you're not connected as well to the transit system, your station isn't going to have as high a ridership. Another one is bike lane density. So the type of infrastructure that was put in place to accommodate bicycle rides also was positively and significantly explained some of the variation in divvy ridership. On the negative side, negative correlated was the population non-white. So that confirmed kind of what was in the media accounts and elsewhere, and also with our ridership numbers, suggesting that race, ethnicity plays some role in explaining variation. So cultural determinants, maybe access and also funding, unemployment, and average distance to divvy station. So how the network was placed and configured in the system also explains some of the variation. Some of the stronger relationships are indicated here. Most of these I just went through. I'm going to go through this quickly with the Uber economic study. I wanted to bring up this study because, again, it has a lot to do with this multimodal challenge we're dealing with. The research objectives here was to explore how the service attributes of, let's say, TNCs like Uber and Lyft, as well as transit, explain kind of what choices people may make. So we look at this from a price and service level, and we're looking at Lyft, Lyft Line, Uber, Uber Pool, and I'm going to go through some of the, very quickly, some of the findings of this. I can tell you that the past research kind of goes in both directions here. Do Uber and Lyft are they complementary services, or are they more conflicting services? And do they take away from public transit, or do they actually enable maybe to fill gaps in transit services? And the research is a bit mixed. We looked at Uber Pool, Lyft Line, Uber Lyft, and the kind of conventional transit, Chicago Transit Authority, looked at their prices and their reliability and time, and what people value, how people value their time. And we looked at neighborhoods in North Chicago, as well as the downtown and outer downtown areas. Essentially, we looked at 3,075 different fares, 614 trips, and we confined it to a 4 to 11 mile range. And we found generally that, first of all, TNCs are much more expensive. CTA prices are in the leftmost column, so we're spending like on average $269, whereas a similar trip for Lyft and UberX, kind of the conventional Uber ride and the conventional Lyft ride, is between about $18. It's a little less when you do the ride splitting, like with Lyft Line and Uber Pool, and you have some savings, about 48%. And 22%, between this ride splitting or your conventional TNC. But there is some differences in average travel time. You save a fair amount of time by taking an alternative, such as, if you look at CTA versus your conventional Lyft and your conventional Uber. In fact, you have 96.1% of all trips that were taken by Lyft that were offered some sort of time savings over conventional transit. So there is some time savings there. Not necessarily for Uber Pool, interestingly, and that about only approaching half the trips offered, a little over half the trips offered time savings. But when it comes to how much you want to translate this into, well, how do you value your time, and how do you you look at your value, the time and how much you would be willing to pay for an hour of time saved, kind of put it in those terms. Then you see that Lyft and Uber can be quite expensive using conventions that USDOT put in place in terms of the average value of your time. For the average passenger, it's about $15 an hour. For a business traveler, it's about $25 an hour. So the percent of trips in which time savings kind of exceeds those standards, for let's say for the business traveler, it's only 11%, 16%, 16.9%, 9.8% for these different TNC sort of rides. So not many. And then you have, it's even fewer trips exceeds the standard when you're looking for the average passenger if you value your time at $15 an hour. So this is kind of interesting from a mode choice perspective, and when you start to put it in dollar terms, what does it mean to you? Public transit actually starts to look pretty good, largely because of the cost savings. But it's very complex. We were talking about the complexity. Not all transit systems are created equal. So if you look at level of transit service, and the conventional level of service A through F, you may find that, where F being, let's say, where uncomfortable, unpredictable ride that is unreliable, being an F sort of service, you're going to have like 83% of trips over total generalized costs, kind of moving to TNC. It would make that a worthwhile trade-off. Whereas if you offer really good level A transit service, those conditions make that trade-off less desirable. So you hear these arguments about, well, should we be improving our public transit service or should we be moving to these other options? Well, it really depends. You can kind of see this. If you're moving your transit service from D to A, you're going to make it much more viable. This is just showing you one last example, because we're going to go on to the next presentation, of the types of transit service in the Chicago system. This is a system map generally looking at the trains and the bus stops. This is the average frequency by time of day. So at 6 p.m., 11 p.m., 1 a.m., 2 a.m. And what we were finding also that the TNCs are kind of filling the gaps at these in these times when you don't have as good a transit service. So I'm going to move on. I have a lot of different conclusions and so on, but we're also doing more research on this. In fact, I know that all of you who are doing research, or maybe even cities who are trying to work with Lyft and Uber and understand their data, we finally got a fair amount of data from Lyft where we have trips for within a 100, 150, and 400 meters from each of the metro stations in Chicago, and we're trying to understand things like, what are the volumes of trips, how does that vary across these stations, what are the effective ranges and travel times of these, what are the demographic characteristics of these trips, and also what is the relationship between how people are using Lyft and so on to get to access transit. So that's kind of upcoming for our own research. So I want to stop there.